If I'm an extreme morning type, can I condition my chronotype so that I become an evening type? I think about it a bit like a rubber band. You can stretch it so far and it's not going to go too much further without the risk of breaking. Chronic circadian misalignment wreaks havoc on our metabolism, risk for weight gain, diabetes, heart disease, etc. If you understand your clock, understand its timing when you should be awake and asleep and productive, you can get the best out of yourself in so many different ways.
Welcome to Smulcast, where we help you live a healthier and fuller life. We're currently exploring the various ways that sleep can impact our health in a multi-part series, and today we're going to be looking at how our body has its own internal clock. We'll be exploring how our circadian rhythms impact various aspects of our lives and how we can work with these rhythms rather than against them. We're joined by Professor Dale Rae, Director of Sleep Science and Professor at the University of Cape Town, specializing in the field of sleep. Dale, it's so wonderful to have you here again.
Thanks very much for having me back.
Dale, can you just start by telling us why you do the work that you do?
It's probably a happy accident, really. I'm trained as a physiologist, but along the way I discovered sleep, and I've really never looked back. So I'm fortunate enough to be able to research sleep in humans specifically. That's my passion, specifically how it relates to obesity and our sort of long-term health with regards to non-communicable diseases. I'm also really interested in sleep and athletic performance as well. And then through all of that work, I was fortunate enough to realize that there was an opportunity to provide a service to people who are stuck with their sleep. And so I developed this company, Sleep Science, as well. That gives me a huge amount of satisfaction, and it's really amazing to be able to take what I learned through academic work, but then translate it, hopefully in a way that's able to help people.
That's fantastic. I'm so excited to get into this episode. And for our listeners, we did a previous episode where we discussed all the basics about sleep, which is episode 6. And we touched on circadian rhythms and different chronotypes. But before we dive into today's episode on circadian rhythms, can you just remind us what they are and what the various chronotypes are?
So the term circadian rhythms really just refers to 24-hour rhythms. Basically, your body can tell the time, and it's really useful that it can because it synchronizes us beautifully to the light-dark cycle, and we live in a 24-hour world, so we need to be sort of synchronized to our environment. But essentially, every single cell in your body can actually, it has a tiny little clock in it, a little molecular clock, and that has a little period that we refer to of being 24 hours in length. And so every cell, every system, and in fact your behavior is all related to this 24-hour processing. And we call these our circadian rhythms, coming from the two Latin stem words circa and diem. So there's a period of about 24 hours, a period of about a day. The biology behind it, we can chat a little bit as we go through, but probably the thing to note is that we probably best understand or experience our circadian rhythms in terms of something that we refer to as our chronotype. So most people have heard of the terms sort of genotype and phenotype. So genotype would be some kind of genetic underpinning of an outward expression, which is our phenotype. So, for example, you have green eyes, I think it is.
Yes.
I've got green eyes.
Yeah.
There we go, genetically driven. So the green eyes are our phenotype. So the term chronotype is like the outward expression of our circadian rhythms, and we experience that behaviorally. So a lot of people have heard of the terms before, owls and larks, or maybe sort of morning-oriented people or evening-oriented people, and that's a way that we're able to sort of classify our chronotypes. It's a little bit simplistic to think that we just have owls and larks. We really probably exist more along a continuum from sort of like extreme night owls to extreme morning people. But most people are somewhere in the middle, the good old neither types, which we can explore that too.
Can you define some of those chronotypes in terms of what qualifies as a lark or a night owl, and then the neutral in between?
Sure. So with regards to the neither types, those are the peeps in the middle. They, in South African terms, would probably relate to having a bedtime of approximately 11 p.m. They're probably perfectly happy to wake up at around 7. There would be, I look at that as a very flexible chronotype, really, because you can tolerate the odd sort of early morning and the odd late night. So it's actually quite a nice place to be. When we look at the chronotype in a large population, we'll find that most people are actually centered in the sort of neither type zone. And then as we move away from the middle and let's look at the morning types or the larks, So again, in South African terms, that would be somebody who's easily up at sort of 5, 6 in the morning. They don't need an alarm to be up then, which sounds quite incredible, really, but for them, it's completely natural. They'll wake up with a bang, loads of energy, very happy to exercise in the morning, usually wake up hungry actually as well, happy to do some good thinking work. They'll often say that they get their best work done in the morning while the rest of the world is still asleep. But by the end of the day, they've completely faded. So they then have a pretty early bedtime, sort of 9 o'clock. Some people actually even 8, which is a bit extreme, but it definitely happens. And then on the other side of the spectrum would be the sort of the night owl. So those who have a preference for evenings. And those are the classic, look like they're fiddling around at nighttime. Like you often think, like, why aren't these people going to sleep? Like, what are they doing? And sort of they're happily purring along through the day until sort of 1, 2 in the morning, or before they're even close to ready to bed. Mornings are difficult for them. If they could, they'd probably sleep until 10, 9 o'clock perhaps on an early day. Generally wake up with no appetite. They absolutely do not want to exercise in the morning. Don't set up an early training run with a night owl. They're not going to turn up. Maybe once and they'll never do it again. And then they typically also will choose menial tasks to do in the morning because their brains are on fire at night, and that's when they do their best work and they're the most creative. So sort of broadly speaking, those are the concepts of the concept of chronotype.
That's really, really interesting. And I think it's nice for people to be able to figure out which category they fit into. I highly resonate with being a lark, and you've validated my very early bedtime. So thank you for that. If we just look at the differences in day-to-day functioning, could you unpack how some of these chronotypes will influence one's day-to-day activities in life?
So I guess the way to think about it is, how does this chronotype, which actually dictates our preferred timing for sleep and wakefulness, if you think about it in very simple terms, then you need to look at how does that fit in with our society. So we in South Africa have a pretty early-oriented society. So generally, most people start work at 8. 9 o'clock would be considered a pretty late work start time. Schools and universities are super early, especially think about kids that have to get to school ahead of the sort of normal 7:45 start time for extramurals, and sometimes they're up as early as sort of 5:30 or even 6 o'clock in the morning. So we definitely have this sort of pattern in our society where we require quite early start times. And so from a chronotype perspective, that suits morning people quite well. None of us see the problem with being at work at 8. I'm happy to have an 8 o'clock meeting. In fact, I'm happy to meet with you at 7.
Yes.
Whereas my colleagues who are night owls, I know, never set a meeting with them before 11 a.m. It is hopeless. They do not want to be there, and I won't get the best out of them. So I think that from a I think I'm thinking about the work sort of scenario now. I think it's quite useful to consider chronotypes and to consider if we want to get the best out of ourselves and the best out of our colleagues, how do we plan our work day, for example, to be able to do that? And there's probably having that flexi working hours, which is something we've learned from COVID. Thank you very much. It's a great approach. So, like, is it necessary to have a hard starting time of 8 o'clock? In some companies, it might be possible to have flexibility. And let's say that as long as the primary overlap is between like 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, then let people work at a time of day at which they're most productive. You're going to get the best out of them. They're going to have the best mood. You're going to give them the best opportunity to get great quality sleep as well. And then I guess another scenario that I sometimes think about, especially now with the Olympics on, is how does this relate to people's to sport? But then for those of us that aren't sort of Olympic athletes, sorry, we don't happen to be there today, damn it. But we often still want to exercise. And so, like, how do we consider sort of time of day and exercise and getting the best out of our bodies then? And the secret is really quite simply to train at the time of day that suits your biology. So there are textbook teachings which will say, yeah, you should definitely compete and train in the afternoon because our bodies are designed to do that. Our temperature is higher and a whole bunch of other factors. Mostly that's actually quite wrong, or it's garbage actually. If you want to get the best out of your training, for example, you should exercise at the time of day at which A, you have motivation, importantly, and B, you're more likely to be able to work harder. So you being the morning person would do much better with morning sessions. And so considering working with athletes, then we need to have a little bit of flexibility as well around group training times, for example. So making sure that a sort of team-oriented athletes, we don't impose a schedule on a team which will comprise morning types, neither types, and sort of night owls, which is going to heavily impair the function and shorten the sleep of certain members of that team.
I think it's incredible that we can use this information strategically and then improve outcomes that way, whether it's through work or sport or any other aspect of our lives. We spoke last time about chronotypes being largely genetically determined, but I'm interested to know if they are at all flexible. Can we play around with that to fit them in with our lives? Can we make it a little bit more amenable?
So the answer is to some extent, and it depends, which are terrible answers, really. So you're quite right about the genetic underpinning. There's now really lovely evidence to show that there's a lot of little variance within what we call our clock genes, which predispose us more to being morning-oriented or evening-oriented, or sort of on that sort of spectrum. But what you're referring to is what we call chronotype conditioning. So the point is, if I'm an extreme morning type, can I condition my chronotype so that I become an evening type, for example, or vice versa? So the good news is, yes, we can absolutely condition our chronotype a little bit to move along the spectrum, but we're never going to make giant leaps. So you're never going to take an extreme morning type and make them an extreme evening type. I think about it a bit like a rubber band. You can stretch it so far and it's not going to go too much further without the risk of breaking.
That's helpful.
Yeah. So I think of different scenarios or things that might condition chronotype. You speak to people, for example, that are in a very structured environment, say in the military, for example, where it's there's no choice about when you wake and when you sleep because you're on a global program and you need to learn to adapt to that program. And so I've often spoken to people who've said, gosh, I'm pretty sure I was not naturally a morning type, but after my military training, I'm absolutely... it's drummed into me that I get up at this particular time, whether I like it or not. And then the other thing that we've noticed through research is that athletes tend to be very conditioned to being more morning oriented. And so even though there might be sort of an athletic team that comprises of different sort of chronotypes in that team, it seems to be the fact that you're training heavily, probably, tends to promote a lot more sleepiness towards the end of the day, which then sort of shifts your sleep-wake patterns and your sleep-wake rhythms, so that we generally find that athletic people tend to be shifted more towards sort of morning type chronotypes compared to untrained people who seem to be well shifted towards the evening types. And then, of course, we think about shift workers as well, and people needing to work on call or on night shift, really. Although it is not necessarily a forever thing, but we're definitely able to shift chronotype to suit the sleep-wake pattern that we need to support our work, although it's not often very well tolerated.
Sure, yeah, I guess that's the tricky part of it, the flip side of the coin. Is our chronotype fixed over our lifespan, or are there certain stages in our life when it differs?
No, it definitely changes, yeah. So you've got the underpinning of your genetics, of course, but if we think about it, toddlers tend to be really morning-oriented. So yeah, most people with young kids can attest to the fact that they're up and going at 5, and you're like, oh my goodness, could you just please give me 1 extra hour of sleep? I'm just asking for 1 hour.
Unless you're a lark yourself, it's quite a struggle, sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they tend to be up and going early. And then there's the classic shift once we reach adolescence to sort of this more night-oriented behavior that comes from 2 things. There's definitely a shift in one's chronotype in adolescence, so you'll become more night-oriented. There's also a change in adolescent sleep pressure, which basically means that at the end of the day, they don't get that same signal to sleep. So it's much harder for them to initiate sleep earlier. And then after adolescence, we'll settle down in our sort of adult phase of chronotype. And then there's one final shift that happens sometime after the age of 60, which is related to aging. And there's a bit of a shift back towards being much more morning oriented. And you'll often hear older people say, oh my gosh, I'm retired and I don't have a set program anymore and my body is up at 5:30 in the morning. It's hopeless. And that's just this final shift in their chronotype.
That's really, really interesting. In terms of, you mentioned military workers or shift workers, athletes even. Is there any potential risk in trying to change one's natural chronotype? You mentioned the rubber band analogy.
So I probably don't think that there's harm in being conditioned a little bit. And I'm saying this quite cautiously because there isn't a heap of evidence around this. But what we are looking to avoid is chronic circadian misalignment. So that refers to you have a natural circadian rhythm, you have a natural sleep-wake pattern, and to get the best out of your body from both a mental health, physical health, and cognitive perspective, you will do well to sleep in sync with your body's own clock as much as possible. So we can sort of try to be a little bit different and to shift a bit on the spectrum. But what we want to avoid is a shift that is large enough to create circadian misalignment. And that is where there is desynchronization between our internal clock and then our sleep-wake behavior and the environmental light-dark cycle. So there's heaps of evidence from shift workers really to show that over the long term, chronic circadian misalignment wreaks havoc on our metabolism, for example, increases risk for weight gain. We were more worried about diabetes, heart disease, etc. And that also has consequences on our mood and mental health. So from that perspective, I think taking an extreme night owl and trying to make them sort of an either type or even a morning type, I think you're more likely to run into trouble sort of taking that approach.
That's, I think, quite practical and helpful advice. If we then look at the long-term risks, maybe not someone trying to shift their chronotype, but just not properly managing their circadian rhythm and working with it. What are the long-term consequences? You mentioned some of them, but maybe if you can just go into a little bit more detail around those.
So it probably still does relate to circadian misalignment on one hand, and then also just, I guess, optimal function, which sounds a little bit obvious. But if we are sleeping in sync with our own natural clock and we're not fighting our biology as such, we are going to get the best out of ourselves in terms of when we're able to think and be like cognitively astute, managing our emotions and therefore the relationships around us and that kind of thing. And so while it's not necessarily that we're going to do any major harm, I think that it's smart to rather work with your biology than against it.
And I think that's what a lot of people would be really eager to hear about, innovative ways to do that, because I guess there's just a lot of ways to think around this. It might not be really simple or obvious, but it might be something that, you know, we can chat about in terms of ways that one can do this. So are there any ideas that you've given people or seen people do to work with their circadian rhythm and their chronotype and fit their daily routine around that?
I mean, the first part is to really just work out who am I in terms of chronotype. And it's interesting there, we can measure this biologically. It's a complicated experiment. We would never do it for the general sort of person, members of the public. It's a bit of a strange experiment, but it's probably worth just understanding a little bit how we can do it and then why we use other measures. So essentially, the way that we would measure a person's real chronotype, which is related to your the timing of your body's circadian rhythms, would be to put you into a little very dark room from about 5 o'clock in the afternoon through to about midnight. And then every hour we'd take a little sample of your saliva, and in that we'd measure your body's melatonin. And the time at which your body starts to secrete melatonin would give us an indication of the timing of your body clock. So a morning person, we would probably, in that black box condition, start to secrete melatonin at probably 6:30, 7 p.m., whereas a true night owl, that melatonin secretion would probably only turn on at say, midnight. So that's biologically how we would be able to sort of measure what this chronotype is. Now, obviously, that is completely unfeasible.
Yes.
What a pity.
As interesting as it would be.
As interesting as it might be. So people have developed questionnaires which ask in many different ways the same question, which is related to your preferred time of day for certain activities, whether they're thinking activities, creative activities, physically exerting activities, etc. And that is able to then provide a person with a score and then see where you lie on that sort of spectrum for chronotyping, and that in itself is relatively useful. I think, though, most people intuitively know. And so we actually just ask people a perfect day question. So on a perfect day. And a perfect day is you have no demands on your time. You do not have to be anywhere. You do not have to go anywhere. You don't have to be responsible to anybody. No one can judge you. That's really important. What time do you think your body would naturally wake you up? And what time would it naturally go to sleep? And that's going to give you a pretty good indication of your innate chronotype. So once you've got that worked out, then it's a matter of saying, okay, how do I now take that information and get the most out of my timing? So if you know that you are an extreme night owl, can you work with your employer, for example, to have a later start time, or to be able to work from home in the first part of the day so that you can have a slower start and sort of plan your exercise for the end of the day? That's how you're going to get the best out of what you do. Another option is, night-oriented people do really well with shift work, for example. So, picking the sort of career types that are more aligned with your circadian biology is great. Or in South Africa, working for a US company, which is behind us in time, for example, working remotely in South Africa is a great idea for a night owl, a terrible idea for a morning person. So, these are some of the sort of more creative ways that we can think around this. And then in terms of a specific case, this is just reality. I saw a young mum who was just absolutely broken, unable to sleep, unable to get sufficient sleep, and had this sort of new child, little baby, was trying to work, was just unable to get her life together. And when I looked at it, she was a proper night owl, but she was feeling that she needed to be the one who not only was with her newborn at night, but also to manage the baby in the morning. And so that was just crunching her sleep time, because she couldn't fall asleep early at the end of the day because she was a night owl. So she was just chronically sleep deprived. And on chatting, we worked out that her husband, who was sleeping peacefully during the nighttime, bless his cotton socks, he was a complete morning type, and he could have been the one up, but they never had that conversation. So it was a practical conversation between a husband and a wife to say, listen, I'm dying here. Can you please take this morning shift for me and let me sleep? It gave her 2 extra hours of sleep time in the morning, which fitted her clock, helped her pay back some sleep debt. And a couple of months later, she was like a new mom. Well, a new human.
Yeah. What a beautiful example of the science meeting reality. That's really incredible. So we're going to wrap up now, but is there anything you want to share with our listeners that is maybe a key takeaway that you would like them to know about their circadian rhythms?
Yeah, I guess just to be mindful of what your clock might be, to try and understand it. Use that to your power. Literally, I think of it a bit like a superpower. I always say that sleep is your superpower. If you understand your clock, understand its timing, when you should be awake and asleep and productive, you can get the best out of yourself in so many different ways. But also to be cognizant of the clocks of the people around you that you're working with. So it helps you set realistic expectations of the people around you, which makes you basically a kinder person too.
Thank you so much for that, Dale. I'm definitely going to go and figure out what my family's chronotypes are and suss everyone out. For our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you've gained some really interesting insights into your own internal clock and have come away with some practical tools to be able to implement in your day-to-day life. For more information, please see the resources and links in the description below, and stay tuned for more smulcast episodes. Until next time, keep ticking towards a healthier, fuller life.